Good evening. And it is true that my name is Michael Chanak. That's my boy name. But I am called Cincinnati's Mother Goose, so call me Goose. That's the story behind that, of course. You know, it's really a pleasure to be amongst all of you tonight, especially during Pride. You know, it's special. And I know some people believe that Stonewall, 1969, the uprising, was sort of the beginning of the modern GLBT movement. But I'm going to leave that to the pundits, because when it comes to history, you know, there's a lot of impressions and a lot of opinions. The thing is, I'm here tonight to encourage your interest, your passion, your need for knowledge of our history that we share together. And I'd point out that even now, this evening, we are making history. We are sharing history right now. You know, Pride is a celebration, of course. But in that celebration, it's very important to remember not just Stonewall, 1969, but the hundreds of years of sacrifice and persecution and prosecution and death for people that believed in another way. So we celebrate Stonewall and its uprising, but we also have to be mindful of the fabric of history that we all are all part of. History has become better documented in the past 50 to 100 years, but there is much of it that's missing. And what has happened is, just a common example, we still have an HIV pandemic. Think of the hundreds of thousands of people whose stories and souls and energy will not be remembered or told. And that's one of the reasons you see my red ribbon in honor of my friends who I lost, and I'm sure many of you have shared in that experience. Some of us have been blessed to know individuals who have been involved in activism for years and even made some history. But there are various ways of knowing history, other than me trying to pretend I know it all, because I don't. But that gets down to, sure, there's a wonderful collection at the Cincinnati Public Library. Near and dear to my own heart is, of course, the Ohio Lesbian Archives. You know, you ought to stop in there sometime and meet Phoebe Beiser and talk a little bit about what they have available to take a look at. But more importantly, I think there's a living, breathing history that is still available to us right here and now. Not just about asking some older person about, well, what's your history, and that might be interesting, but to know everybody's story, regardless of age or background, because the tradition of oral storytelling is how tribes kept their history alive, and we also can keep our history alive by knowing each other's stories. Now, I've got some doozies, and I'm not going to tell you those tonight, but I do think in storytelling we preserve our history, and it's often overlooked, but it's something that's really personal if you listen to people. Now, to wrap up this evening, I'd be failing you and myself if I didn't acknowledge we have some very tough times on our hands here in the state of Ohio and elsewhere. Listen to this. House Bill 616, the Don't Say Gay bill. You know about that. Or House Bill 454, the so-called SAFE Act, which isn't anything safe for transgender youth. And also, this one has actually gotten through the House and is pending Senate action later this year, House Bill 151, the so-called Enact Save Women's Sports Act. You can well imagine it bans transgender folks from competing in high school and college sports. Yeah, that'll be before Ohio Senate later this year. Sometimes it feels, as an individual, there's little that we can do, and how we can change the course of these actions. They sometimes feel inevitable. But here, take a word from history, and I even looked at my own life. When we banded together, put our superficial differences and artificial distinctions aside, look what's happened. Think about this. We've seen in the city of Cincinnati, it's become more equitable. The FDA in the 80s was forced to fast-track drugs. for HIV patients. Sexual orientation and gender identity were added to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act in 2020. Marriage equality, our folks serving in the military, imagine all these things. And even P&G, who we call Mother Proctor, my former employer, in Cincinnati, is embracing our communities throughout the world, and not just in June and through advertising dollars, but by actually raising funds that support LGBTQ groups. You know, our cause, I believe, is just. The struggle is long. The history shows us persistence, boycotts, pickets, protests, voting, making folks uncomfortable, and showing up in places we shouldn't be. And all the while, again and again, telling our stories, our truths, because those stories and those truths can not only change Cincinnati, but Ohio, and perhaps the world. Please remember, Pride was born of struggle. Happy Pride.